We're delighted to have Brad Cloepfil here tonight of Allied Works. I've been personally a big fan of the work of the office for a long time after seeing his art and design museum in New York, which opened, I think, in 2008. If you go to their website, you will see examples of beautiful drawings and models that are used to inspire both their clients and their own designers to push projects to their fullest potential. I think that I always refer students to their work when I'm trying to get them to understand the idea of partie. So I'll just introduce Brad with a bit of information about him and his background. He's a graduate of Columbia University. Glasses on. And he opened the office of Allied Works in Oregon in 1994 and another office in New York City in 2003. The office has been recipients of numerous design awards and is highly recognized for the cultural projects, among them the Clyfford Still Museum in Denver, the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, the Seattle Art Museum, and the University of Michigan Museum of Art. And most recently, they have completed their first project in Canada, the Calgary National Music Center, which is another wonderful building. Their commitment to meaningful and authentic work emerges from its specific locale, community, and culture, and is always embedded in a strong conceptual idea that represents that's represented in their very evocative and exploratory drawings and models of exceptional beauty and poignancy. They are makers dedicated to the exploratory process of design, using a variety of materials and techniques to investigate form, craft, and to convey the spirit and potential of a project. The recent traveling exhibition called Casework, Studies in Form and Space and Construction, showcased the design process in the Clyfford Still Museum and was recently published in another beautiful publication. So I'll pass the podium over to Brad Cloepfil, and we hope to see behind the process tonight.
Well, thanks for forsaking, it's really loud, isn't it? It sounds loud. Thanks for forsaking your deadlines, those of you who are here. I'll try to make it worth your while. I was actually at Columbia last night, and I heard a lecture by an Indian architect who's an urban designer, and heard him talk about practice, and it made me realize I've been trying to describe what we do for a long time, and I don't know if it helped, but it made me think about it some more, and it seems like right now, and I'm probably missing nuance and certain obvious facts, but it seems like right now there's so many different practices in this field. You know, when you say architecture and you go to architecture school, and the influences you're exposed to through your faculty and the choices you have as a young architect, I don't think they've ever been as broad. And it's kind of an amazing moment that way. I mean, there's social practice and collaborative, interdisciplinary practices, and obviously commercial practices, which is the normative thing that disconfigures most of our cities, right? Then there's sort of spectacular practices who pursue novelty as much as they possibly can and brand themselves, God knows, commodity practices. And then there's whatever we do, which I still can't describe. So maybe by just taking you through our process on a few projects, describing how we think. I mean, I am a believer in buildings, which almost seems regressive at this moment in our cultural history. But I really believe in the power of built things to move you and to affect our perception of the world. And an individual building can do that. And I think in my education and my early travels, I encountered some of those. I encountered those spaces in landscape, which I'm sure you do here if you drive north very far. You know, you find those moments that are so powerful and moving and evoke that emotion of awe, which then opens up a kind of wonder about the world. And I think buildings can do that. I think as small as an active building may be. So for me, I look at things. I try to identify the forces that make things particular, that make things resonate. And I think there's two images here that have always struck me. The lower right one, where the abandoned course of a river creates an environment for one species of tree that can only grow there, right? And creates that beautiful landscape form. I want my buildings to be that specific as that kind of ecosystem. And then that Native American bridge, which I've never figured out where it is or when it is. An artist friend of mine sent me that photo. But if you think of them cantilevering trees and strapping them, and cantilevering trees and strapping, it's the most beautiful piece of structure, of trial and error structure, and kind of indeterminate thing that I could possibly imagine. So, like I said, I try to respond to forces. This was a photo from my house in Portland, where there's this crazy juxtaposition of going downhill 400 feet in elevation with an entirely different climate that I woke up to one morning. And then I look at the work of artists. I mean, my generation of architect, it was a dark time in undergraduate and graduate school for architecture, particularly in the United States. And so it was a very regressive time, somewhat like it is now politically, I guess, in the United States. But it was a very regressive time in architecture. So for progressive thought, I looked to artists. And I was going to graduate school in New York, and I was introduced to a lot of these people's work that I thought was really profound, and the clarity of the thinking, the concentration of ideas, that notion that you can use whatever means and whatever media to put ideas out into the world, and then for architects to build upon those, and we'll talk about that relative to caseworks in a minute. And then I had an opportunity to work with Richard Serra, citing one of his pieces in the St. Louis Art Museum early on. But I had already known his work, and when I first encountered the torqued spirals in Chelsea at the old Dia space, knowing that someone had worked in plates of steel for, I don't know, at that time, 40 years, 30 years, and then had this breakthrough to basically make entirely new space that none of us had ever seen before. The discipline of a practice, of just the notion of coming to know a material, of staying with its possibilities, evolving your thinking along with that material, all those things, tremendously inspiring. That's the piece that he cited. Working with artists like Anne Hamilton in various collaborations, and then in a house that we did in Dutchess County, working with Doug Aiken, the artist. It's probably make the lecture way too long. I have to go through a lot of slides, but we did this building. we were doing this building on 400 acres in Dutchess County, and it was on top of a knoll with spectacular views. And these people had 400 acres and were big art collectors. And I was trying to make this building has translucent, etched, and clear glass, and then these stainless steel mesh panels. And I was this kind of orthogonal helix thing, and I was trying to bind it to the site and let it be transparent but visceral, and doing all these things. And Doug Aiken wanted to talk to me when the house was under design about what the ideas were. And he got so excited about the ideas of the house that he proposed this art piece. So he filmed the site for a year from different prospects and different times of day and season. And we sited 16 different projectors. And when the sun goes down and you hit the switch, the building really does blend into the landscape in a kind of crazy, decontextualized way. It's just an extraordinary, extraordinary thing. So I'll talk about our process, and it begins with drawings. I draw in charcoal. But it's really, this early conversation is about a kind of desperate quest for the idea or the possibility. I mean, I approach projects not with any preconception of architecture, but looking for the architecture, trying to find out what architecture can do, trying to discover what architecture can offer. And I think that thought, you might mull that one over for a while, right? Once you have a general sense of the discipline itself and the power of the medium of architecture, I think to pause and say, can architecture actually help this? Or can architecture advance some form of understanding or insight, or amplify a condition, or elevate an institution, or celebrate some kind of ceremony? What role can architecture play in this? Because architecture, a lot of times as architects, we're asked to do something that's totally wrong and not what we should be doing. In fact, most of the time. Because lay people don't know, they have some needs, somebody gives them some money, they think they should do building. So you have to help them, because we generally know what architecture can do and not do. And there's a lot of stuff architecture can't do. So I think starting with that thing about trying to understand what it does. This is a sketch. You guys will appreciate this in a deciduous forest land. I'm from the Northwest, where there's conifers. Forests are black, dark, scary places. 4 or 5 months out of the year, they have no light. And I got this project in Dutchess County. This came before the glass house, to site the guest house. And I went up there in the winter, and it was just this abstract landscape of black lines and snow. I think it was the most beautiful thing. It was like a 3-dimensional drawing. I'd never seen anything like it, and I'm absolutely genuine. And so I had this thought, if I could just weave the house through that beautiful landscape, that would be the thing to do. So we developed these 2 counterposing cantilevered steel tube structure, and then filled it in with wood and glass, and sited it above a little creek. And so mahogany panels, mahogany windows, and an 8-inch steel frame, and just sort of wove it into that place. But that little process of just kind of looking and thinking and asking, what can the house do? What can it bring to the site? Or what can the building do? And this is one of the truest statements that's ever. I don't even know who Walt Stanchfield is. Anybody know? I have no idea. Somebody Google. Could have been a criminal, we don't know. Kind of great art forger or something. But that idea of how many bad things we have to do. There's a liberation to that, I think, if you realize that most of the stuff you produce is really bad. But somewhere in there might be something good. Yeah, you'll see, there's a bad drawing. That's the first sketch I did for a library project that we were doing for a while. I can't even remember what I was thinking. Maybe I was just pissed. I don't know. But I draw in charcoal. And then we use every possible medium we can find. And not because it's just fun to work in different medium, although it is, but I try to use the right material or medium and scale of endeavor, whether it's glass, porcelain, paper, wood, charcoal, pencil, for what the idea is and where we are in the process, what we're struggling with, what we're trying to understand, what we're trying to communicate to ourselves. All of these models, concept and study models, are really for us. And then we had these things sitting around the office, and working in art museums, and curators and directors would come through and go, oh my God, these are beautiful, you have to have a show. And I put it off forever, because these were never intended to be art objects. They were never intended to be artifacts in and of themselves. They were really for us. They were our kind of work product. So finally I had this idea, and it was both a kind of political moment for me and a kind of understanding of how to talk about the work, is that I thought, to show non-representational ideas of architecture, i.e. they don't look like images of buildings, but they're the core and essence of an exploration for buildings in this very image-laden time, with all this great software skill that's sitting out in this room, right? You guys can instantly make a building so much more beautiful than I can, that it takes me forever and ever to do. Even with the best young interns in the office. But so I just thought putting these things out here that aren't necessarily representational of buildings would be a kind of counterpoint. And then the idea of presenting it as the sort of byproduct of work, this idea of casework. So these are our toolkits. So we designed a bunch of tool cases to represent these artifacts. This is a lot of these artifacts are tell you how to lose competitions too, by the way. There's some real cautionary tales. This is a concept model for a museum. We were in the finals. Most of these things we were in the finals for things that we lost. This was a museum in Lausanne. And then the notion of the building was sort of splitting it open to the landscape, weaving it into the landscape, views out to the lake. This is a model for a museum in Wisconsin where flying in, I saw that beautiful tiny scale of quilted landscape. So we kind of reproposed the Wisconsin landscape in these walled gardens and then enclosed them with these porcelain light scoops for the Kohler Museum. This is maybe the end of a cycle. We were in the finals for this beautiful arts building in Santa Cruz at the edge of the redwood forest looking out over the ocean. And I proposed this 1,000-foot long building that was of timber. And so the model we presented to them, and we did have renderings, but I think this just scared the shit out of them. We showed them this thread model, and you can imagine your facilities guy from UC Santa Cruz, what the hell is that? No idea. And that was really what it ended up. It was really a beautiful, potentially beautiful thing. The first sketches for the I forget which museum it's called, but the one in Quebec City that we lost to RIM, which ended up in this bronze model, this kind of braid of space that connected the park to the city, intended to be concrete. And then a winery that we did in my home state of Oregon, wanting it to be pressed to the earth and carved, kind of pressed and carved of the earth, and ended up in a wood building, beautiful carved wood building. I apologize, I don't have the rendering there. So then how to present these objects and sketches and things. So we developed 10 different tool cases, tool chests, each of which that implies a kind of infinite search. Some are mirrored, kind of open and mirrored. They're all about this high, this wide, something like that. We built these, basically, young architects, interns in Oregon, built these with me in our shop. Some of them endlessly unfold, some of them sort of flip, again, all implying that it sort of unfolding a never-ending search for ideas, and then housing some of the bits and pieces. This was a peep show project that shows one of the you look through that little brass aperture and you see the concept model in this projected in the site. Very fun, very, very, very fun thing to do, but it allowed me. This is the concept model and the process models for the addition to the Met that we lost to Chipperfield. Yeah, this is a heartbreaking saga here. I'm looking for tears. But really exciting to be in these conversations. And then how to present those things. So you have these tool chests, how to bring them up to a relationship with the body. And a lot of my conversations with artists, from Ann Hamilton and Doug Aiken and others, is about how one engages the body in these works, which is really fascinating to me because most of the time the scale of things that we do, especially the structures that we do, are so enormous, and so getting to think down at these scales. So we created a series of portals that you would walk through that would also hold these things at kind of eye level, and you would enter into this labyrinth of kind of doorways, steel transparent doorways, and engage these bits. So that tells you sort of how we work, and you'll see some of these reflected in the projects. We come back to them. We'll do a concept model in design development later on because I'll feel like we're losing it. Architecture takes forever. You guys think it takes forever when I can't even. Thinking about how much work students do by themselves and how much work I do with 5 or 6 people helping me, and still it takes 2 years, 3 years. It takes forever. It's so hard. So to try, and when you're trying to enact these things, you have the forces of culture and the local builders' abilities to do that, the contractual structure, the budget structures, the client. It's a brutally hard endeavor. So going back and referring to these concept models and sketches to remind ourselves, when you have to compromise, which you always have to do, you can't give it away, though. There's a moment, and I've seen it, and maybe you all have seen it, when you Or maybe you just in your own design process, you wake up one morning with a new idea and you try it and fail and your old idea is gone. It can happen like that. So that's what those things are for. They're really just reminders of us of what to keep us on track and keep us evolving the idea. I mean, and those bits and sketches are also intended to inspire us because they're not resolved. You know, that crazy Cantonal Museum in Lausanne with the split wood and the gold leaf. I mean, that could become so many different things, right? But it's just, to go from a charcoal sketch to that is better than cardboard. You know, it communicates more. You know, so you learn from them too. They're also for us to generate from. You know, they're not, that's why I could never really present them as objects. And most of those things, and I'll get to that in a minute, I never showed clients. They were for us. They were all for us. And we'll talk about that. So, National Music Center, Calgary, crazy project, 2008 or whenever it was. You know, they sent out this brief international competition. We Googled it, National Music Center Canada, didn't exist. First of all, what the hell is it doing in Calgary? Nobody knows. Nobody still knows, right? We can talk about that. But we Googled it, and it didn't exist. And so we have this brief for a competition for an institution that didn't exist. It was a small little music museum, basically keyboard museum, that was funded by a really significant donor who had this vision that Calgary needed something of this stature, and he loved music, and his mother was into music, and he was the genesis. And patronage is a huge part of this story. And patronage doesn't always mean money, but it means vision. And that's how extraordinary. So they bought this site or they got the city to give them a deal, the empty block over here and this site, and they had an idea of creating a bridge across the street that goes right to the Stampede grounds and be the genesis for the redevelopment of this whole East Village, which has actually happened. So I went to the interview. We had renderings too. But this is what I explained the building with this concept model. And it's the first time I had led with this non-representational thing, right? And you have to understand, lay people don't know. It's like, is that what my building's going to look like, right? So you're confusing them from the start. And also the genesis of this model, the students might appreciate too. So the idea of this thing is 5-story towers. I looked at these beautiful landscape forms, the hoodoos in southern Alberta, and these gorgeous wood grain elevators on the prairie, and this incredible, amazing landscape in Alberta. And I wanted these things to have a kind of monumental, in a devastated neighborhood, so they had to have a monumentality to stand. So 5-story towers with this different life of music in each one, teaching, and exhibition, and all this stuff. So we were doing all these tests, and they were all disasters. They all looked like, anyway, they were terrible. So I got, all worked up, and I said, can't we just go to Goodwill, get a musical instrument, cut it up, and cast it? And that was like a metaphor. And young students, went to Goodwill, cut it up, cast it, and brought up the first piece, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, it just captured the spirit that we were after. So that's what I presented, and it got the job. And so after we won it, I wanted the building to not be 9 and then 4 more across the street or whatever, separate towers. I wanted it to feel like one building. So how can this building weave itself back together again spatially as it goes 5 stories high with all of these different functions and program? And that was really literally the first sketch I did, or series of sketches, is can these things kind of touch each other and rely on each other spatially, and then became structurally. And we started with paper, trying to figure out, and this is again about the medium to explore the ideas. How can these things, how quickly can we fold paper and staple it and pin it and try to figure it out? And then obviously moving into digital models, lots of different ways for these things to evolve and touch and interlock structurally and become interdependent. And ended up in this model, which is not CNC milled. I wish it was, but it's just laminated and then milled. And it shows the 2 different structural systems that we ended up with. So where 3 towers start as rectangles and then from the top and then merge and touch and create these big transfer beams at the 2 lobbies. And then the opposite happens where the towers begin as rectangles at the bottom, merge and touch, and then suspend the bridge over the road, and then suspend the performance space that you see in that kind of half arch on the right. And then those 2 things interlock in section and pass by each other. And that's the system that we developed for this thing. And then how to clad it. I wanted it to be bound to the earth. Again, it was standing alone when we designed it. So looking at materials that were sort of visceral and earthbound, and then played with the light, and then thinking about and those are that was for the street surface, which is all orthogonal, and then the minute you step off the street, those surfaces start to move. And evoking that concept model, I wanted those surfaces to really reflect and play with light, and so coming up with some idea of a platinum glaze. So this is all the kind of graphite on the outside, and then the what I call the platinum glaze. It's hard because it changes color from like green to gold to blue, it changes so many different colors. Working with Royal Tishalar that we worked with on the or on the Museum of Arts and Design in New York, 500-year-old porcelain company, to invent these glazes. Takes about 9 months to I wave my hands and talk about equality. It's a fantastic collaboration. It's been an amazing thing, and that's not a model. That's the building, and just watching, and we learned so much afterwards because you can't draw these things. And we learned that the thing is most alive in those beautiful, cloudy, stormy days in the prairie. That's when that glaze goes crazy. You'd think in sunlight or something, but no, cloudy, stormy days, it just goes totally nuts. So you see the transfer beams and the bridge and dashed light walking into the lobby, and then you look up from the lobby to that hung piece of structure that lifts above the auditorium, and those are operable panels that basically play the building. I had been, and I got to meet David Byrne. It was so exciting. David Byrne proposed this project when we were designing this down in the ferry terminals in New York, and where he hooked up an old organ to these little hammers on the pipes in an abandoned building, and he played the building. And it was unbelievable. It was so cool. Super cool. So I wanted this to play the building. I wanted when there's concerts or people practicing, the idea of this room is that when people come to a concert down the hall, down the street at the formal symphony hall, that they could come and practice here beforehand, and it would just fill the building with music or different kind of concerts. So the walls open, and it goes up through all those crazy interstitial spaces, and that's the auditorium. And you can see the building already start to shift and move very, very, very subtly. And then how they touch on the top floor to span over. And then you're looking up from the lobby. Some of you, I understand, or at least one of you has been there. That's one of the 4 people that have been to Calgary in the last couple of years, as far as I can tell. Bless their hearts. But it's kind of an amazing space. And the idea was that the building would evoke that sense of wonder of the landscape. That's the kind of gift of Alberta, and that would create a mystery that you would never, not that you would be lost, but that you would see bridges and walkways and surfaces, and you get glimpses down to, and that you would always be kind of engaged and curious and coming back. And then when you come back the next time, you get a different glimpse and a different quality of light, and that the building creates a kind of life and richness that keeps you engaged and provides a sense of memory. It's the National Music Centre of Canada. I mean, we felt tremendous responsibility in this project that it had to represent a kind of iconographic gravitas, because it's representing the nation and the history of music and the aspirations for music, the possibilities of Canadian music. And it was kind of claiming Canadian music again, which I completely understood as I was told how all these musicians that we all thought were Americans weren't. A substantial amount of musical culture in North America. So there was a really great purpose to this as well. Lots of interactive exhibits, working with the exhibit designers. But then, since most of the exhibit designers the exhibits are electronic and interactive, the building is really other. It's really a kind of two-world where you walk through this landscape of architecture and then enter into these enclosed interactive spaces and then back out, and look across at the other bridge and quality of light. And just we had no idea how to draw this. No surprise, the contractor had no idea how to build it. So we ended up doing most of the construction drawings as well. And they're kind of modified grasshopper, rhino combination of things. I mean, there was a couple people in my office that could kind of go between different platforms and blend them together. And we didn't have Revit, and we created the digital models that everybody used to build the buildings. And I say that to just reflect a kind of commitment that when we've designed recently a couple very complex things, and a lot of times the building culture doesn't support it. They don't build complex things in the normal building culture. And so your responsibility is to help them figure it out, and we cared deeply about building, and so we were in there doing all the drawings, laying out all the studs, I mean, virtually everything. Very exciting. And again, that project had a patron in Ron Mannix, but it also had an incredible young director in Andrew Mosker, back again to who wanted Calgary to have an important piece of architecture. He'd never raised money, he'd never run a cultural organization, he'd never done anything. And the force of will of those two people basically made this happen. Clifford Still Museum. I'm going way too slow. I'll try to pick it up. Clifford Still Museum competition. When I was in Columbia in the mid-'80s, I was a kid from the suburbs of Oregon. I didn't know anything. And I was introduced to mid-century modernist art, along with some of the other artists I showed you in the beginning. But I knew Clifford Still's work. And so when this competition came up, and it was an invited competition for this museum, I was just completely thrilled. So how to build a building, and it's really interesting. It was before the National Music Center, but after the National Music Center. No, before. No, after, that's right. It was after the National Music Center. I can't remember anything. But to build on the prairie, Denver, everyone thinks Denver is this big mountain town, and it's on the short grass prairie. And so it has this incredible light. Again, I think it's 300 days of sunlight a year. So no one had ever seen Clifford Still's paintings in natural light ever when they had been displayed, and I wanted them to be shown in natural light. So before we even interviewed, when I flew in to just look at the site, I did these concept sketches. The idea that the building be wedded to the prairie, to the earth, thus the black and the mass in this plan and section, and that light would penetrate deep into that body. The white, rooms of light, both of those things with the blue and the white representing rooms of light. And so we did this concept model. There's a park in front of it, and then the building on the left, and I wanted it to be the landscape and the building to be one thing with this rooms of light and this kind of luminous ceiling. And we did this concept model. This is the first one I did. But we didn't show it to the client right away because we were a little apprehensive because it doesn't look like a building, right? Anyway, we ended up showing that to him in the competition after we presented all the other stuff and the renderings and won the piece. And then this was one of the first sketches I did about wanting these rooms to kind of rattle around and blur into the landscape, and that the building would be embedded in trees. I didn't want the building to be seen as an object. I wanted it to be discovered through a grove of trees in the park, and that the kind of dappling light of leaves and the concrete itself and everything would kind of blur into one thing. So this is a mid-process concept model where I did a charcoal sketch on a plane, came home and said, can't we just run out this thing? And we had this piece of recycled wood in the basement, and again, someone went down there, and like a half hour later, this thing came up, and it just blew my mind. And then so knowing that we could make rooms, not a flexible museum, but a kind of made museum for known art, known pieces, known scale. We could proportion the rooms for that art, which is really a luxury, and then we could structure those rooms out of, structure, unchangeable unchangeable material. So endless studies of how the structure would weave together and overlap and cantilever and span to create that series of rooms, and ended up with this, and I'll talk about the exterior in a minute. But a big 150-foot long cantilever that's only 10 feet high, ceiling compressing you to the earth as you walk in, and then archives and support spaces on the lower floors, and then moving up to the light and the galleries above. And then light penetrating in, back to the blue sketch. There's gaps between the galleries that come down to the archives, so when you rise up and move through the art, you see that there's more down below, and there's kind of more to explore in the open storage and archives. And that's the view from down in the open storage and archives looking up. So kind of true to the concept sketch, those slots down ring that central gallery. And again, there's a logic to all of these bits. When they span, there's nothing below it or nothing above it. So how the rooms turn and twist and meet tangentially. And then it took a tremendous amount of work to get the director to let us hang the art on the concrete. He was terrified about it. We did a full-scale mock-up of half a gallery before he would agree to do it. And only where there's sheetrock is where there's insulation. So where the building needs insulation, there's sheetrock, and where not, we have the concrete. And then the roof itself, we'll get to in a minute. So materiality, these are these beautiful basalt columns in eastern Oregon on the rivers. The idea of the building having that kind of mass, it was the recession, so the concrete contractor had nothing to do but do hundreds of mock-ups for us. Thinking about how you place, that was an incredible opportunity. Thinking how you place the concrete, wanting it to feel like it had mass. Also wanting the concrete to be not designed by us, so it would move in ways we couldn't control or interact with salt, which was not very smart to put salt in concrete with reinforcing steel, so we didn't do that. Also not very smart to have these dry lifts where ice and water can get in and freeze and break things off. So we had a lot of bad ideas. These are really, really bad ideas. The Shag carpet formwork is one of the best things I've ever thought of. But you know, we were just trying to think. And so we finally came up on the lower left. So the lower left was like leaky formwork. The upper right is like formwork that was so thin that the water pressure would make it move. So we could place the concrete and not control the outcome. And we didn't want because I didn't want the design of formwork to interrupt your seeing the art. I didn't want the kind of preconceived geometry of it. So many, many more mock-ups with the mix of the concrete and what it takes, the thickness of these fins, and how to miter the wood or leave the gaps between the wood. Crazy, crazy research into all this so that it did that, and it kind of broke. And then you can imagine architects in the room. Having contractors break your building as they pull the forms off. It just goes against everything they've spent their whole life avoiding. They're terrified. And we had to work and work and work with them to just, it's okay, and then how much is okay? It doesn't matter, because we had done enough mock-ups that we had a general sense of what it was. And I wanted the shadow play. That's also what it was. These 300 days of light and the different angles of the sun. So this very simple building of a very simple geometry would change. When you would see it in your day-to-day life, passing by it at lunchtime, it would just look different, and you'd have a different experience. So then, wanting that space to be one thing, this is still one of the most inspirational artists. Eva Hill does these complex pieces of porcelain. I need to meet her someday. Some of them are really big, too. How she does them, I have no idea. But I wanted the building to feel like that. So you're always in one space, one body. So you're held with Clifford Still's art in one body. And then the light itself, the building is all site-cast concrete, as is the ceiling. It's a big site-cast slab. It has structure. You can walk on it. But it filters and diffuses the light. And there's a tremendous amount of technical work with the distance and the layers of diffusion and things to talk about. I'm actually teaching a light seminar right now. This features prominently, but all of the shapes and the geometry have to do with the angles of the sun and diffusing the light down onto those walls. And trying to diffuse the pattern. Like you can see certain angles, it sort of turns into water. You can't really tell what the figure ground is. And that was also the intent. But working with the structural engineers and the daylight engineers at Arup, kind of an amazing exploration. How are we doing here? Well, not so bad, right? Metropolitan Museum of Art. We were in this competition for over a year, and as I said, it was down to Cloepfil and us. And I was from Oregon. No, that's not fair. I'm sure he did a very beautiful. I haven't seen it. I'm sure he did a very beautiful solution. No, we had a great email exchange at the end. It was really funny. So it's that upper right-hand corner. They were tearing down an old contemporary wing, trying to connect the building to the park and create a new home for contemporary art. So spending a year with the curators and the collection of the Met was one of the greatest gifts I've ever had. Trying to understand how one adds an architectural voice and a voice of beautiful art space to a really extraordinary and sometimes crazy context, how to connect to the other collections, to the park, to the city, how to bring light down through a 3- and 4-story building to fill the galleries with light. And came up with an idea of the park and the building interweaving, in this case the building being wood, and shafts of light coming down in these gaps between galleries. And then came up with this sketch of also wanting the structure and the lights to come down in the same way. So sometimes the structure would stop and transfer, and you'd have bigger gallery spaces, but whether it penetrated or stopped, that the structure and the light would be in the same gaps. Various studies breaking up that structure with transfers, creating a diversity of space for the curators to use, different scales of spaces, different qualities of light, dealing with the structure and the vertical services, and then thinking about how much light can get where and how you can control it. In section, again, working with daylight engineers in Arup, Brian Stacy and his folks, and then coming up probably with a plan that you can't read. But opening up to the park with a new lobby, which is that, with these fins of site-cast concrete, in this case clad in limestone, because it is the Met. But you see some of them stopping and transferring in those gaps, different kind of orders of structure and light, falling through the building together. And those shafts of light then are diffused by both the structure and the dimension of clear story. So even, this is not the top floor, so this is the one floor down from the top floor. You create clear story light, and you can actually create enough, because of the size of those shafts, clear story light to light the art. So it was really kind of extraordinary thing. The top floor, and looking down, some of those as the circulation moves through those shafts, and then this incredible technology with the daylighting engineers. It's so much fun. 20 years ago we could not have done this. They have all the sky dome data for the whole world. So at November 27th, with these apertures in this town, with the diffused light coming from there, they can tell you what the light level is on this wall. It's amazing. It is absolutely amazing. And then in museums now, you average light over the years, so sometimes the light can be too hot for the art, and then sometimes too cool for the art. It's just a really fascinating. My career in art museums and the technology of daylight engineering have sort of grown together. Looking back to the park, wanting the building to be transparent, but also having to diffuse west light. Early sketches of trying to create a filter or a screen or God knows what, and then ending up with this idea of it being a lens both onto the park and into the building. And there's a place called Bullseye Glass in Portland. Does this amazing art glass, and coming up with a slump glass, kiln formed slump glass system where we could laminate diffused, articulated, all kinds of different glasses together to kind of tune the light on this facade and hang them in what we said was bronze frames. Maybe that's why we lost the competition right there. That would be a very expensive skin. But that was the effect. So you'd see, you'd bring light to this facade, or bring art to the facade that could take higher levels of light, but you'd see people and activity and life in the park, and then it would change over the course of the day and the course of the seasons, and really open the Met up to the light. And then the south facade being the structure exposed, and just that sort of quality of materiality and light. Last couple of projects. This also related to light. I mean, there's all kinds of conversations about building again for a nation overseas and trying to understand the diplomatic mission in these very complicated political times. We were given this site, 10 acres, with a grassy open site on the Indian Ocean, kind of extraordinary site, to create a whole compound that basically becomes this focus of the whole American community in Mozambique and Maputo, not just for the 450 people that work in those 3 bars. So the office bars were really set dimensionally because they buy hundreds of millions of dollars of office furniture. And so how to open those up to views of the ocean and the hills beyond, and then also layer the landscape to try to hide the security fences. So it's not just this walled compound, which it does necessarily need to be. The bars themselves kind of split and shift open to views and light, and then developing the skin, which I'll talk about, which, since it's on the Indian Ocean and has spectacular views, wanting it to be transparent, but then having so much heat gain, we developed a skin that would basically block all the direct sun. And then a section where you come in, there's levels of security, as you might imagine, very high levels of security, but when you come into the first lobby on the left, you can see through the whole life of the gallery, the whole life of the embassy. So again, it doesn't feel this foreboding thing, kind of more inviting. This was a different political climate, by the way, than we have now in the United States. But wanting people to feel welcome and that we're in your country and we're there for for some good reasons. So the skin itself, developing this screen to diffuse light and to block sun, working with Arab again. It's a 4-foot serrated precast concrete bit that was initially structural, because I had this idea of it being redundant for bomb blast, a kind of, structural skin. It was a little too far ahead of where where things were going at that time. This is about 5 years ago. So it just became a sunscreen in the end. But working with that SkyDome data, developing these geometries to each facade, specifically to block the sun from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. And they're huge. Some of these are 4 feet high and 30 inches across. Very, very large-scale things that prevent any sun from coming in, and sort of tuning the building for the views and the sun on that spectacular site. Oh, this is just for fun. 2 more projects. I have a bunch of daughters who grew up with the U.S. women's soccer team winning the World Cup, and Mia Hamm and all of these people. And so my kids played soccer their whole lives, and one of them actually plays professional soccer today. So living my life with soccer, living in Portland, right 2 blocks from the Timbers MLS stadium. And when they won the national championship a few years ago, I went out and bought lunch for the president of the club who I'd met, just to basically bask in the glow of someone that won a national championship. I never... And it was fantastic. And at the end, I asked them, so what are you guys going to do? You have a 20,000 person stadium. This is actually a good, hold this thought, and we'll talk about it a little more at the end. 20,000 person stadium, how are you going to pay for these $10 million players? Soccer's blowing up in the U.S. You're going to move to the suburbs, and what are you going to do? No, we have this landlocked stadium in Portland. We want to stay. And I said, have you ever studied how many people you can get in there? And they'd work with HOK on stuff, and I'd never done a stadium, I don't know anything. And they said, no. And I said, well, I'll take a look for free. Just because they're not going to hire us to do that, because we don't know shit about stadiums, right? Why would you hire us? And he was totally confused. He didn't know if I was serious or joking or what I was doing. And I was in New York a couple weeks later, and he called up and said, were you serious? I said, yeah, we'd love to do it. So I said, we'll take 3 months, and see if we can figure something out. And so instantly, like, what the hell are we going to do? We don't know anything. Do all this research in all these different stadiums all over the world. Boca Juniors, very famous club. On the right hand of this left-hand image, you see this vertical tray. You know, they're totally landlocked stadium, and they just went vertical. And I called it the Globe Theater of soccer. So I applied that vertical strategy to this piece on the bottom. The little J piece is the historic stadium from the 20s. Our office is like really 2 blocks down here from it. And so we did a 4-story tray of seats and got 4,000 seats added to this little stadium and got the project. You know, it's a propositional thing. But again, it was just sort of curiosity, you know, and you know, young energy to burn. Looking at the crowd here, because we did a ton of research. And then we got to design this amazing structure. So how do you structure? I wanted the structure, it's a 150-foot cantilever out over the existing, or the new tray and over the existing seat. You'll see this section in a minute. And then I wanted to pull those down to the ground. So the whole building would be kind of encased in a steel, and we don't do a lot of steel, so a steel mesh. And so looking at braid structures, which are a thing, looking at all these different kind of poetic precedents, you know, how to give this thing a kind of ambiguous texture. Anna Skibitska, if you don't know her work, they're little rods of glass. They're the most amazing things. You know, trying to give it a kind of indeterminate texture, not just a series of trusses with a roof and kind of the kind of direct sort of statics relationship. So there's the little tray that moves up. That's one of the 4 floors, and the light is the seats, the existing seats, and the dash is the roof, and there are these concrete frames. So big ass thing going out over it all, seats rising up, tied back to the street. So we did endless digital studies, and I don't have a lot of them because they were all done on the models in this case, so we never kind of saved the images. These are the facade, obviously way too complex, way too much structure, but kind of beginning with trusses and primary trusses, and then how to get the forces to transfer and move. I mean, because we know enough at Allied Works now about structure to know not how to do the analysis, but to intuit ways that everything is integral, right? And the goal is so that they can't value engineer anything away, right? That's the game. Remember that one too. So, you know, this trying to make this kind of somewhat inconceivable pattern of structure that's a kind of mist or fog of elements to do this 150-foot cantilever that bears on these concrete frames. So very fun, just kind of pure structure vignette, very low budget, steel tubes, you know, things I never thought I would be working with, frankly, but have achieved it. And it's starting construction basically now. They just lost in the playoffs. So it was bittersweet. Now the project starts. So I'll end with the National Veterans Memorial and Museum. This was conceived, I think, after Calgary. Very, very ambitious architectural project from a structural point of view. It was an empty site across the river from downtown Columbus. That the site was bigger than the building, so I wanted it, and they wanted it to be, well, it's the National Veterans Memorial. So again, kind of iconography and importance and communication, but being a small building of about 40,000 square feet, how can it hold that site and kind of have a kind of presence and prominence? So kind of conceived of as an earthworks piece that rises up with a processional that takes you to this amphitheater for decommissioning and coming home ceremonies and memorial ceremonies. So that was this was the competition model. And you'll notice under this thing, there's no idea what holds it up, no idea what the structure is, but just that kind of charcoal sketch lifted up into this kind of, you know, lyrical form in the park. Those are the competition renderings that went with it. This is even bigger scale than it got built. It actually got built much smaller than that. Part of a potential development again, where they are now redeveloping this whole area. This is an all-new building, except for the Izozaki kind of boat thing on the top. And then the building itself, working with Olin and Ralph Applebaum. Very interesting in both of these. I mean, you can kind of, there's a thread through this between the Timbers and this and the National Music Center, where we got to invent the building, the program, the solution, the structure, everything. I mean, this didn't exist. There was no director in this institution. They wanted a memorial. John Glenn, Senator Glenn, wanted them to build a monument to veterans that represented the idea of service, because he thought as Americans we were losing this idea of service. Not sacrifice, not military. It's a really compelling thing. So Lori Olin, Ralph Applebaum, the exhibit designer, and I got to really conceive this thing together. It was a very, very exciting thing. So win the competition. God knows how we hold this thing up. No idea. Woman in my class went off to Harvard, learned how to work in porcelain, came back. We did these crazy porcelain concept models of these interlocking rings of structure that would kind of rattle around. Then the idea, I found this photo of lifting the thing up from the earth. And when you tear, when you don't cut all the way through wood and the fibers kind of hold it. So the thing is bound in some way to the earth, a later model. And so using concrete, these big concrete arches, 165, 180 feet, that actually cantilever out in space as they come back down and interweave. And then they're held together by a tension ring at the top that keeps them from falling out. So crazy, crazy structure. The early kind of analytical models on the top, sort of reality at the bottom when the structure got really fat. But then you understand, you'll see the building in the end. The scale is so enormous. And then, of course, it rises and falls with that ramp and the curve of the amphitheater. So the whole crazy thing moves around a ton. Working with the engineers and the digital models, it's pretty funny. Not all that funny, frankly, but that's when you're totally screwed right there. And that those things are going to double in size, basically. And it's also a series of transfer beams. It's sort of cantilevers, bearing arches, transfer beams, and then all held together with a tension ring thingy, that thing that kind of holds it all in place at the top. So we went through 2 structural engineers. There's a bunch of cautionary tales in this presentation, actually, because I knew it was possible, I should say. I knew that the principles of these things as cantilevered arches held back and transferring, and where they intersect, what the spans are. I had again, intuitive sense that it was doable, but boy, finding people that could do the calculations, it's like just because you draw it doesn't mean they can engineer it. And so we ended up working with Knipper, a German firm, to do it. So later renderings of the actual design, and they kind of peel off and pass by each other, and engineers love that when they touch tangentially, and how do they really transfer the forces. It's quite a challenge, and those are the final renderings from the L'Oreal Memorial Grove. So 3 rings of structure, roughly 25 to 30 feet, kind of gallery width, set by gallery, kind of conventional gallery spans. The spans themselves are just simple steel because, a lot of sophistication in the concrete. And this is the lower floor where you come in, the students come in and move up. And you move through these layers, weave through these layers. These are kind of very crude early renderings. You move through these layers of structure that kind of rise and fall, so the light changes and the views change. And these all get glazed, which has already happened since I've been there. I think I have some photos of that. And you walk around this piece, and it just sort of tells the story of the impact of military service in this case. But it's a very, very compelling. It's not just about the soldiers, it's about everything and everybody and what it means, and it's been a very exciting thing for an art museum designer primarily, who I don't even know if I have any friends that served. Having my father, World War II, of course, but it's been a really compelling, very moving experience for me. And then that's the main entry with the great hall, moving around the galleries, doubling back in the second ring, and then ending up in the center ring with this video and the letters home and the whole kind of crescendo, complicated section as it rises and falls. Very difficult thing to build. We, going through all the engineers, finding the German engineers to work with, who would, take it on and work with us. And then we worked, this is a little too architecture talk perhaps, but we always pre-select the contractors because you can't do things this sophisticated without help, and you have to get their buy-in or they'll fight you all the way. So we brought in a concrete contractor very early on, actually paid them a couple $100,000 to work with us, and got all the drawings done, all the permits, ready to go, and they quit. Too hard, we don't want to do it. That's never happened before. So the client calls, you can imagine, client calls, what are we going to do now? And I'm thinking, no one wants to build this building. I can't make people build this building. How do you get people to build your building if they don't want to build it? And I'd never been in that situation for 2 months. We couldn't find a concrete contractor, so the thing just sat there. And we finally found one, Baker, who's amazing, who would take it on and, generally within the budget. But it was a strange thing. Again, you guys, with the technology we have to draw it, will someone engineer it? Even though it's intuitively, structurally sound as an idea, then you can engineer it, you can draw it, but will the building culture of whatever community you're in embrace this thing and try to build it? It's, we're kind of right, clearly with Calgary in this, we just went right to the edge, right? Well, this one we kind of went over the edge. Some of these walls have 11 layers of reinforcing steel. It's essentially, back to the concept models, if I was going to redo this, it's a textile building. This is essentially a textile building. The concrete's just there to protect the steel. It's this incredible textile building. The steel going up was so beautiful. And then the formwork, figuring out the formwork was unbelievable. Those little boxes of cells, they developed these little cell modules to be strong enough to hold the concrete up and then also be able to follow the curves. It was a kind of amazing thing. We learned, you can tell, we learned a tremendous amount. There it is in its kind of pure state. I still can't believe we built this. I'm dead serious. I don't think, it'll probably never happen again in my career. And the concrete contractor they're so proud. It's really fun. It's a really fun thing to pursue and get through. And there it is right before the glass goes up. So I'll wrap up here. I talked about process and the tools and the kind of what I would hope you would have is a sort of lack of fear to explore ideas in different mediums. Any way you can to find the idea, get the idea out, convince yourself it's worth pursuing, prove that you're wrong and it's a terrible idea, whatever it is, that kind of just zeal and will to generate visual tools. We're a visual practice, right? So putting it out there, not in your notebook, not in your head, putting it out there in whatever material you can, at whatever stage of the process, you learn so much, and they're inspiring and they're generative, and it's a really great discipline to get yourself to do. And then I guess the second part is there's two more parts, sorry. The second part is to kind of make your own project, and I think a lot of people today are doing that more than ever before. The normative culture of architecture has become so incredibly commercial that I think in some ways it's liberated a whole other practice of propositional work. So many young collaborative teams doing things and making pavilions and homeless housing and anything you can possibly do. Again, it's like a scalable concept model, whether it's a bike shelter or a bus shelter or a homeless, housing unit or whatever it could possibly be, just to get those things out there as propositional pieces, I think are I mean, they're fantastic for you, but I think they're critical to the culture. And I think there's this mode of architecture. I mean, we did the Maryhill Overlook. I don't know if you guys know that piece. First thing I ever did was this landscape piece. And I think for me, those propositional pieces that are kind of in between installation art and architecture is a realm that we're starting really as a practice to own, and I think it's inspiring, very, very inspiring. So making your own projects, whether it's a soccer stadium or a bike shelter, it doesn't matter. And I think the courage that I've gained, that if you're just curious, I was talking to some people here today that I won't talk about, but if you're just curious enough to ask the right questions, of the people that own the stadium, right? Just ask the right questions, and then offer to help. And again, we as architects, the discipline of our creative process, what we learn in school, it's a unique tool. My wife is a very accomplished digital designer that went to the Media Lab very early on, data information designer, but she was trained as an architect, and she credits everything she does to the training she got in architecture, the discipline, the rigor, the process, the analytics, all of that stuff. And I think once you feel the power and the confidence of it, it takes some time. It took me like 25 years. You can propose things. I mean, you really can, and it's an amazing experience. And then the last thing, I do this work because I want to create things that matter. I spend the time to do the research, the different modes of exploration, whether it's, drawings, models, structure, materiality, detailing. I do those things because I think architecture matters. And I think the more focused the architecture is, and it's funny, it's almost like the object of architecture is so out of fashion because there's so many bigger ideas and bigger narratives out there, socially, culturally, economically. But the resonance of a beautiful, powerful, thoughtfully intentional piece of architecture goes so far beyond the object and the impact it has on people's understanding and experience. And I think doing the research and design research, not just analytical research, but the design research to focus the impact of that piece and making it as razor sharp, it opens up the world to people. It opens them up to see things they've never seen, to experience a sight in a way you've never seen, to understand the idea of service, or to hear music in a way you've never heard it before. And those things resonate and stay with us. Those of us that are lucky enough to experience those rooms of a Gothic cathedral or a beautiful landscape, those things are in your memory, and they kind of fill you up. So that's the quest that I've been on in my career, is to offer that, to find out, to find what the building can serve, back to the beginning. What can the building serve? What can it offer, and what can it elevate? And then to try to pursue that as rigorously as possible. Thank you guys for taking time out of studio. It's so great to be here.
I'm sure there's some questions. Would anybody like to ask Brad questions? Mike.
Doesn't sound like it's on. Mm-mm. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your lecture. It was very inspiring, especially the design process. I think as students, we focus a lot on the functionality and the technical implication of the building, which I wouldn't argue is a bad thing, but
No.
unfortunately, in the end, we kind of end up with like building design, not necessarily architecture.
Yeah.
So you find that during your design process, when you make these conceptual models, at the back of your mind, do you think of like the physical constraints, like building code and like structure and that?
It depends on.
Indulge yourself.
Yeah, it's. I don't consider it indulgence either. You use different tools to address different issues at different parts of the process. I mean, buildings take a minimum of 3 years from start to finish, drawing to end of construction. I would say good buildings, good buildings too. You can do it faster. We've done it faster too. But, so there's time to address those things. And there's a right time to address the various things. And you'll discover them in the process too. I think that's the thing too. If you just trust the process, those things, it'll be very clear when it's time that you've got to address those things, right? You've got to really get serious about structure or whatever else, whatever other functional concerns you may have. I mean, I'll say something about function. Again, most people approach you as a client with a function that's based on very normative things, because that's all they know. And so usually they're wrong, and you can help them understand better ways to do it. So, where it could be restrictions that you're not meeting their quote program, their program is just their best guess. They have, so you can, most of those things are highly interpretive, including codes. I've never met a code I couldn't break. And I mean that sincerely. You just have to be smart, find out what it's trying to do, what it's predicting, what it's based on, and you can modify it. I mean, it's all doable. So if you need to modify those things, you can modify those things, right? And if the will is there, and the reason is there, and a lot of the reason our process is so open is so the clients, the contractor, all those other people get it, and so they help. They know what you're trying to do. It's not just the architect, great master, dictating, I need to break the rules, or I need to do whatever, which is the norm, I think, frankly. But no, there are really no constraints. We deal with real constraints all the time, but it doesn't constrain us conceptually, right? Because also, if you're conceiving something in concrete and it costs 10 times as much as it should, you're conceiving something in the wrong material, right? You're wrong, right? So you got to get back to somewhere and think of wood trusses, or God knows what it is, right? I mean, you just have to trust it. But you have to be free in the beginning. I always tell students, I don't care if you use dirt, sticks, straws, old dirty socks, you can use anything you want to express the idea, and students never take me seriously. I've yet to get dirty socks. I think I don't know if it's our education culture or the cultural moment right now where students are so job-focused, product-focused. I don't know why, but it's a rare school where kids feel free to do that kind of work and try to figure out how to make it into a building later, Someday it'll become a building somehow. We'll figure it out together. So.
So, in an interview you gave, you were asked about how you foster innovation in your office. And you responded saying that you don't try and foster innovation, you try and foster specificity. And I think that really speaks a lot to the way your projects have been presented throughout your career in a really beautiful way. I want to talk to you more about how do you foster, as your office grows with creative people, the energy to keep up that level of specificity when you might not necessarily be there on the ground for every single project.
Yeah, it's happening as we speak. It's a really interesting evolution. You have to have a couple drinks. Go over that. It's to develop a culture of questions and how you approach the projects and the questions you ask, and continuing to ask questions, which can be really brutal. We just had a very candid conversation with some of them. I've had people, there's about 8 people in my office that have worked with me for 15 to 20 years. And the practice doesn't get easier the way we do it, because we push, question. And it's hard work. It's really hard work. But we have a culture of questioning. Now we're trying to learn when to stop questioning. So people survive, right? And so you can get these things built. You have to. We wouldn't get this much built if we didn't know how to do that. But it's a really interesting thing. But I think the culture that we have of inquiry, both the medium that we use and the process we use, is shared, again, with people that have worked there for a long time. But new people coming in, it's not taught, we find. A few practices. If you've gone and worked for some really good architects, it's around, but it's a rare thing it's a really rare thing.
In your projects, in this presentation, you often talk about how you had this vision, you had this idea, and I find that often people have ideas and vision and then they develop the project, but unfortunately at some point they have to give up a part of this idea or a part of this vision.
Yeah.
Have you ever encountered that, and how do you feel about this?
I mean, no, I genuinely haven't. Right, and I think it's if you hit a point where you're giving up part of it like that, you did something wrong. You got to back up. No, I'm serious, because I'm talking about real things though too. See, so on your own, it's like it's the hardest thing in the world, right? But if you encounter something like that, it means you didn't take the time in the beginning to understand the project enough, what it offers. We don't try to turn every project into Bilbao, Every project's not Bilbao. But you can do amazing things with little modest projects if you take the time to think about it and ask the right questions and prepare, really prepare the thinking and do the work, conceptual and analytical work, to try to understand it. Yeah, it's really seeking understanding of what you can do. And in some ways, what you should do or shouldn't do. Like we did a new headquarters. This is a true story. And I know people want to go. So we did a headquarters for Uniqlo. I don't know if you know Uniqlo, big Japanese, huge thing. Richest man in Japan, Mr. Yanai, comes to my office in New York, sits down with his interpreters for everybody, and I'm all nervous, and I'm showing him the Pixar thing we did and this other Wieden & Kennedy advertising, showing him workspace. And he goes, "That's so amazing. I want that for my people. I want this collaborative, all this stuff." And I asked him, and because I really was trying to understand, and I was also afraid of messing things up. I asked him, "Why do you want to do this? You're the richest man in Japan. You're opening 2 new stores a week in the world. You're the fastest growing retail brand, all this stuff. Why do you want to do this?" And I don't think anyone ever asked him that. And he stopped, and then he went into this whole description of where they were meeting these problems and couldn't hire people and do these things, and went into Japanese work culture and all this stuff, and it was fascinating. And I was in. But then you knew what you were after, right? It wasn't just make cool workspace. Anybody can make cool workspace. In fact, most people can make cooler workspace than me. Is that it?
I've got
One more.
I thought it was really powerful when you said that you actually make concept models during detail design.
Yeah.
Because I find a lot of people, as the technical aspects and as the detailing goes, sometimes people lose the concept. But in a lot of ways, that's your opportunity to actually express the concept more fully.
Yeah.
You can kind of unpack a little bit more about how you refer to those models and how you use it to fully grasp.
It's just, I don't have a lot of those there's a lot of mid-scale stuff that's not as pretty and evocative as that carved wood thing, right? But you just step back and do more diagrammatic analytic stuff. Like if we compromise this detail here, what's it going to mean 10 details down the road? Those things snowball, right? And what does that mean? So you kind of step back and do the analytical work of the kind of systems and order of things and how they come together. So that's stepping back is critical. And people hate it. People in my office hate it. Because you're in the deadline and I can't believe we have to step back. And, but sometimes you just have to, because you can just tell when you're detailing yourself into a corner, because you're forcing it, back to her question, you're forcing it so hard. And if you're having to fake something and do something and add this piece of bent metal, you're just no. Something, we did something wrong. Go back, something like that. Cool. Stop there.
And thank you so much. Really, really enlightening. And I love the fact you draw in charcoal. I think that's. I want to see everybody put down their fine point pens.
Oh my God.
They try and draw with very fine point pens very early in the process in their sketchbooks and it never works. You gotta be
Yeah.
loose.
Wait, I have to
Loose
speak.
and dirty.
Yeah, I have to speak to that. There are people who can conceive in fine point pens. I think there's 4 of them in the world that are that good. You know, I think Julie Neruda, the artist, if you look at her work, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful draftsperson. But the right medium at the right time for conceptual. Fine things are for doing working drawings, beautiful working drawings. And then you draw, but those choices matter. Sorry, I kept talking.
No, that's great. Thank you. So